This time we're going to talk about the Clash's classic album, London Calling. I have to say this is a little intimidating because everybody knows this album and it is, a contender for the greatest rock and roll album of all time. And so, nothing I say here is obviously definitive or even probably a patch on what other people have said, but what the hell, gonna give it a shot. So, like I said, this is one of the greatest records ever. It's a double album which was sold for the price of a single album, which is a story in itself, which I'll mention in a bit. And it's an album which catches this group in a completely transitional moment, like a lot of great records. It's around, moving from what had been to what was to be. And funnily enough, as always, doing that transition, they hit a height that they never really hit again. The first thing to say is, and this is something which always, I guess, puzzled me back in the day when I first heard this album so many years ago, because this was actually my introduction to The Clash, and I only picked up their earlier records later on. I guess the big question about this album is it a punk rock album? Which kind of, I guess, gets to the question of, what's punk rock? Is punk rock a musical style, or is punk rock an attitude towards music, or is it both, right? And I guess you can make a case for any of those. Clearly, this is not punk rock in the way that either we had gotten, people had gotten used to hearing the Clash, or obviously the Sex Pistols, or any of the other sort of contemporaneous bands, or the subsequent U.S. sort of hardcore bands, or Canadian hardcore bands. It's not punk rock like that. I think about it, there isn't really an out-and-out track on this album that you would call, this is clearly a punk track. There's a punkness to the singing, and there's certainly kind of a punk attitude to the lyrics and so on, but this is, I think, as other people have said, much more astute than me. Whether or not this is a punk record is still a controversial thing. For me, it's a punk record, but weirdly, I would say it's a contender for the greatest rock and roll album ever, but I don't know it's necessarily the greatest punk album ever, so if that makes any sense at all. But anyway, this is all definitional crap. Doesn't really matter. There are some interesting stories about how this album came to be, and of course their first two albums had been pretty much sort of straight ahead punk rock that we kind of associate much more thrashy guitars and sort of high tempo punk rock themes and so on. While they toured in support of those albums, they were listening to all kinds of stuff. They were touring the United States. They were, as Joe Strummer says, they were not a lazy band, right? They weren't just hanging around and waking up in hotel rooms a few hours before the concert. They were out just looking at everything, absorbing everything, taking in all kinds of new ideas and influences. And so while they were touring in support of The Clash, which was their, nominally their first album, it was their second album released in the U.S., they were formulating the ideas for this album, and their influences were R&B, ska and reggae, classical rock and roll, jazz, all kinds of different influences. And they knew they wanted to put together an album which had all these eclectic pieces on it, but they also knew that it was going to be tough to do so in the environment they were in London, where punk was such a political thing. And I think I forget who it was that said it, but they felt kind of oppressed by the punk police, right? Well, that's not punk rock, or this, punk rock had to be a certain way. So what they did was lock themselves down with their producer for about 6 weeks, working 18 hours a day, and did not let anybody else in. They did not let all the hangers-on, groupies, whatever, did not let those folks into the studio deliberately to keep themselves in a bubble and away from the pressures and expectations of the scene that they were part of. And this record is what results. And it was incredibly well received, not just by the punk rock press, but also the mainstream rock and roll press and music press and so on. So it was an album of really really broad appeal. So famously, this is a photo which their tour photographer took of the, whose name I think was Penny something or other. Hang on, it'll say on the back. Penny Smith, yeah, there you go. So she took this, and this is Paul Simon, and this is his bass, and he's smashing it out of frustration about the seating arrangements in this club in the U.S., which is where this photograph was taken on this tour, and of course the classics of Elvis Presley lettering and so on. Now totally recognized as, like, you know, one of the most instantly recognizable album covers and images ever. It's a double album, but it's not a gatefold. CBS Records, which was their record company, said, okay, we're good for a single album. The Clash wanted to release a double album, but charge the price of a single album. And the record company said, no, can't do that. And the Clash said, okay, well, can we have a single LP plus a bonus 45? And CBS said, okay, you can do that. So of course, the bonus 45 then turns into an extra 9-song LP, and we're all the beneficiaries of that particular decision. The music, London Calling, I don't know how to even rate that song. It's just the very opening bars are such a kind of a call to arms and so energetic and ominous and foreboding and thrilling. I don't know about other people, but I can't hear those opening bars without just being thrilled, frankly, and just going, oh, this is great. Now I know what I'm doing for the next 4 minutes of my life. So all the way through, total eclecticism, right? So Brand New Cadillac, which apparently was their warm-up song at a certain point. This is has a kind of, if you know the Cramps, it's like that psychobilly sound, but before it actually existed. It's a cover of an old English rock and roll song from the late 50s. Great guitar in that song. Then there's the jazziness of Jimmy Jazz. Hateful, which is one of my favorite songs on the album. The group vocal in the chorus I think is so great. Rudy Can't Fail, which is like that sort of ska reggae influence, which is Paul's influence largely on, but I guess all of them too were listening to that. But this was one of the influences which he was bringing to the band. Then Spanish Bombs, about the Spanish Civil War, or kind of also about ETA, the terrorist group, so on. Guns of Brixton, another that is a Paul Simon song, and that's again a very reggae-ish kind of a tune. And again, their fingers are right on the pulse of what was happening in London at the time, anticipating the riots that were to occur. There's a great song which is, again, sort of anticipating the Thatcher era, which was just dawning. It's the song Clampdown. It's all about sort of the anticipated hardships for working class kids in the coming era. Then we get to record 2, which is the bonus album that CBS Records didn't think they were getting. Great, sort of a ska covers, and then Death or Glory, which is just a great sing-along. Other real highlights from this are Revolution Rock. It's a cover of a song by a guy called Danny Ray. The original is totally obscure, so this guy must have made massive royalties off this, which is just nice. And then that great song Train in Vain, which closes out the album. And as you'll note, I think this was fixed later on, but it was just sort of slung on to sort of fill out the LP, and it should occur here, but it's not noted on the album at all or on the inner sleeve. On top of that too, apparently nobody knows what this song is about, so make of the lyrics what you will. Became very well known, not least because it was released as the B-side to London Calling when that was released as a single. So, I don't know what to say to anybody who hasn't heard this record. If you haven't heard it, you should. It's incredibly fresh. It's very brave. I mean, they had so much confidence, or stupidity, but I like to think of it as confidence. They just did not give a damn about what anyone thought about their influences. And this goes to even their image. Like, there was so little that was actually calculated about the Clash, and yet their genius was such that they just, they produced amazing music. They had a look. They were part of this, this general movement, and arguably the greatest punk band of all time. And yet, none of it was calculated. It was just driven by this, just the creativity that they had inside them, and the talents of so many different talented people in the band. So what can I say? I love it, and there you go, The Clash, Live by the River.